The hall stood tall and quiet long before the audience arrived, and its wide doors opened slowly as workers moved inside carrying chairs, music sheets, and soft lights. And this place had seen many performances where trained musicians played exactly what was expected, and nothing more, and people came here believing they already understood what talent looked like and how it should sound. The walls were high and pale, and the ceiling curved gently above the stage, and every sound echoed with clarity and discipline. And this was not a place where surprises were welcomed, because tradition mattered more than feeling and precision mattered more than expression, and anyone who stepped onto the stage was expected to respect those unspoken rules. As the morning passed, the hall began to fill with quiet movement and whispered instructions, and among the workers was a young woman who blended into the background with ease, and she moved carefully, carrying small items, adjusting chairs, and responding quickly when spoken to, and no one looked at her twice, because her role was not meant to be noticed. She had grown used to this way of being unseen, and it did not make her bitter, because she learned early in life that attention was not something freely given, and she accepted her place with calm patience and a steady heart, and she focused on doing her work well without asking for anything beyond that. Inside her, however, lived a different world, one filled with sound, memory, and emotion, and music had been part of her life for as long as she could remember, and not through lessons or praise, but through quiet moments alone when no one was watching. And she learned by listening, by repeating, and by feeling each note until it stayed with her. She had first touched a piano many years earlier in a small space where no one cared whether she played correctly, and that freedom allowed her to learn honestly and without fear. And over time, her hands grew confident even though her voice remained quiet. And she never spoke about this part of herself, because she believed it belonged only to her. As the day of the event moved closer, the atmosphere inside the hall became more formal, and the organizers spoke about timing, order, and simplicity, and they reminded everyone involved that the performance was meant to be controlled and respectful, and that nothing should distract from the structure already planned. The young woman listened silently as she worked, and she heard them mention that one short piece might need to be played as a placeholder, a simple tune that would fill a small gap. And no one treated this as important because it was meant to be brief and ordinary, and she did not think much of it at first. When the request finally came, it was given without thought or expectation, and someone pointed toward the piano and asked her to play a simple tune just to check sound and timing. And the tone was casual, almost dismissive, and no one looked at her face to see how the words landed. For a moment she stood still and felt the weight of the room, even though it was mostly empty, and her hands felt warm and unsteady, and her thoughts moved quickly through doubt, caution, and memory. And she wondered if she should refuse, but she had never refused a task before, and she stepped forward quietly. As she approached the piano, her breathing slowed and her focus narrowed, and the noise around her faded into distance. And this instrument was familiar in a way that felt personal and grounding. And when she placed her hands on the keys, she did so with respect and care, as if greeting an old friend. The hall remained unaware of what rested within her, and to them she was simply filling space, completing a task, and following instruction. And no one expected anything beyond a few clean notes played without error. And this moment settled gently into place, marking the true beginning of a story no one yet understood. As she sat at the piano bench, she adjusted her posture, slowly feeling the smooth surface beneath her hands and the familiar weight of the keys. And she reminded herself that this was only a tune and nothing more, and that she was not there to express or reveal anything private. And this thought helped steady her nerves. The hall was still mostly empty, yet a few people moved quietly in the distance, checking lights and sound, and they paid little attention to her presence. And this allowed her to breathe more freely, because she had always found comfort in playing when she was not being watched, and the absence of expectation gave her a sense of safety. She tested a few keys, softly listening to how the sound traveled through the room, and she noticed how every note carried farther than she expected, and how the hall responded with clarity and strength. And this reminded her that this place demanded honesty, because every sound was exposed and could not be hidden. Her fingers rested on the keyboard and muscle memory guided them naturally, and she began with the simple tune she was asked to play, keeping the tempo steady and the volume controlled. And she focused on precision rather than emotion, because that was what was expected, and she respected the instruction given to her. As the melody moved forward, something subtle began to shift inside her, and although she stayed within the boundaries of the tune, her touch grew warmer and more confident, and she allowed the notes to connect naturally rather than mechanically. And this was not a choice she made consciously, but a response her body had learned over years of quiet practice. The sound filled the hall more fully now, and one of the organizers paused mid-step and turned slightly toward the stage, and another worker slowed their movement, as if listening without realizing it, and still no one spoke, and the young woman remained unaware of the small attention beginning to form around her. She kept her eyes lowered and her expression calm, and she did not add anything extra or dramatic to the music, yet there was a sense of sincerity in how each note followed the next. and it carried a feeling that could not be planned or taught, and it came from familiarity rather than ambition. As she reached the end of the tune, she allowed the final chord to settle naturally, and she lifted her hands gently from the keys and waited for instruction, expecting nothing more than a nod or a signal to step away. And in her mind, this moment was already complete. What she did not see was the quiet change in the room and how the simple act of playing had shifted the energy of the space, and how a few people stood still longer than necessary, because something about the sound had reached them unexpectedly. And this unseen reaction marked the next turning point. Still forming quietly beneath the surface, she rose from the bench slowly and stepped back, giving space to the instrument as she had been taught, and she waited for someone to speak or gesture, and when no one did, she assumed the task was finished and returned to her work with the same quiet rhythm she had carried all morning. The hall continued to fill as time moved forward, and the audience began to arrive in small groups, their voices low and measured, and their movements careful, as if they were entering a place that demanded restraint and attention, and they took their seats believing they were prepared for what they would hear. The young woman moved along the edges of the room, adjusting small details and avoiding the center, and she kept her eyes down as she always did. And yet she felt something different inside her chest, as if a door had been opened slightly and left that way without explanation. She told herself it was nothing and reminded herself that she had only done what was asked, and that moments like this passed unnoticed every day, and still the feeling remained steady and present, and it stayed with her as she worked. As the event prepared to begin, one of the organizers spoke quietly with another, and glanced toward the piano and then toward her, and there was a brief exchange of looks that carried uncertainty and curiosity, and she noticed this from the corner of her eye and felt her shoulders tense. She wondered if she had done something wrong or if the sound had not met expectations, and her thoughts returned to caution and restraint, and she prepared herself for correction or dismissal, because that was what she understood best. Instead, the organizer approached her calmly and spoke with a polite tone, asking if she would be willing to sit near the piano for a moment just in case. And the request was simple, but it carried a different weight than before, and she nodded without question and followed. She returned to the bench and placed her hands in her lap and waited, and the hall now felt larger and more watchful, and the presence of the audience changed the air, and she became aware of every sound, movement, and breath, and she kept her posture still and respectful. The piano stood in front of her, silent and ready, and she avoided touching it again because she had not been asked to play, and she did not want to overstep, and she focused on remaining invisible even while seated at the center of the room. From the audience, some faces turned toward her briefly, not with interest but with curiosity and confusion, and then they looked away, assuming she was part of the preparation and nothing more, and this allowed her to breathe again. The music scheduled for the event had not yet begun, and there was a pause filled with quiet anticipation, and in that pause the young woman felt the weight of possibility without understanding its shape. And this feeling rested with her, calmly waiting for the next instruction that would move her forward without warning. Time moved forward slowly inside the hall, and the low murmur of the audience settled into near silence as people adjusted their posture and prepared themselves for what they believed would be a familiar experience. And the young woman remained seated near the piano, still and composed, yet inwardly alert to every change around her. She kept her hands folded and her eyes lowered, and she focused on breathing evenly, because being at the center of the room made her aware of herself in a way she was not used to. And she reminded herself that she was only there as a precaution and not as a performer, and this thought helped her stay grounded. From the stage area, a quiet discussion took place among the organizers, and although she could not hear the words clearly, she sensed uncertainty in their movements and tone, and one of them glanced again toward the piano and then toward her, as if weighing a decision that had not been planned. The scheduled performer had been delayed, and the audience waited patiently, unaware of the small disruption behind the scenes, and the organizers spoke softly about filling the time and keeping the flow of the event intact. And in that moment, the idea of a simple tune returned to the room with new urgency. One of them approached her again and spoke in a measured voice, explaining that there would be a short delay and asking if she could play the same simple tune once more just to keep the atmosphere calm. And the request was framed as practical and temporary, and still it carried a sense of exposure she could not ignore. She felt her chest tighten briefly, and she considered the size of the room now filled with people and the way sound would travel without barrier. And she hesitated only for a moment before nodding, because she had always believed that doing what was asked of her was the safest path forward. As she turned toward the piano, she became aware of the audience in a new way, and although most were not looking directly at her, she felt their presence as a collective weight, and this made her hands feel lighter and heavier at the same time. She placed her fingers on the keys once again, and the instrument felt familiar and steady beneath her touch. And she reminded herself that the tune was simple, and that she should not change anything, and she began to play with care, keeping the melody clear and restrained. The sound moved through the hall with ease and reached every corner, And although the tune was uncomplicated, there was a warmth in how she shaped the notes, and this warmth drew attention quietly and naturally, and people began to listen without intending to. A few heads turned toward the stage, and some conversations faded as the music filled the space. And the young woman remained focused on the keys, allowing her hands to move as they had many times before. And she did not look up, because she knew that looking at the audience would break the fragile calm she was holding. As the tune continued, she felt a sense of presence settle into her body, and this presence was not confidence or pride, but a simple acceptance of the moment as it was. And she allowed herself to stay there without fear and without expectation. The hall grew still, and the sound of the piano became the only movement within it. And this shift marked the point where something ordinary began to transform quietly into something meaningful, though no one yet understood the direction it would take as the final notes settled into the space. She let her hands rest briefly on the keys before lifting them away, and the silence that followed felt fuller than before and heavier in a way that made the room pause, as if everyone was waiting for permission to breathe again. She stood up slowly and stepped back from the piano, believing the moment had passed, and that she could now return to the edges of the hall where she belonged. And yet no one spoke right away, and this absence of instruction made her feel uncertain and exposed. From the audience, a few people shifted in their seats and some leaned slightly forward, as if trying to understand what they had just heard, and this reaction was quiet and restrained. But it carried a curiosity that had not been present earlier, and the young woman felt it even without looking. One of the organizers finally nodded and gestured for her to remain nearby, and the motion was polite but firm, and she obeyed, taking a seat close to the piano once more, and keeping her posture composed and respectful. The hall now felt different from how it had felt at the start of the day, and although nothing visible had changed, there was a sense that attention had moved and settled in a new place. And she felt this shift internally like a gentle pressure against her chest. The audience members exchanged brief glances, and some whispered softly to one another, wondering who she was and why she had played. And these questions moved quietly through the room without reaching her ears, yet the energy of them traveled and made her aware that she was no longer invisible. She focused on steadying herself and reminded herself of her purpose and her limits. And she told herself that whatever others thought did not change who she was or what she had come there to do, and this inner grounding helped her remain calm despite the unfamiliar attention. Behind the scenes, the organizers spoke again, more urgently now, because the simple tune had done more than fill time, and it had changed the mood of the room, and they realized that the audience was listening in a way they had not expected. And this realization brought both opportunity and risk. The young woman remained unaware of these discussions and sat quietly with her hands folded and her eyes lowered. And she felt a strange mix of relief and vulnerability, because playing had always been private and safe for her, and now it had reached beyond that space without her choosing it. The piano stood silent once more at the center of the hall, and it no longer felt like just an instrument waiting to be used, but like a presence that had spoken and might speak again. And this thought made her heart beat more steadily rather than faster, because familiarity brought comfort even in uncertainty. As the minutes passed, the audience remained attentive, and the usual restlessness before a performance did not return, and this calm attention was unusual for such a formal space. And it signaled that something in the rhythm of the event had already shifted. The young woman sensed that this was no longer just a matter of filling time, and although she did not know what would be asked of her next, she understood that the simple act of playing had placed her at the edge of a moment that could no longer be undone. And this understanding rested quietly within her as part one moved toward its close. The wait that followed felt longer than it truly was, and the young woman stayed seated near the piano, aware of every small sound in the hall and of the way people now held their attention differently, as if something had been gently rearranged without announcement. An assistant approached quietly and spoke to one of the organizers, and their exchange carried a careful tone that suggested a decision forming. And the organizer looked once more toward the piano and then toward the audience, and finally toward the young woman with a thoughtful expression. The audience remained settled and attentive, and this steadiness gave the room a sense of shared patience, and people who had come expecting formality now leaned into curiosity without fully knowing why, and the atmosphere softened while staying focused. The young woman felt the weight of the room, but not as pressure and more as presence, and she reminded herself to stay calm and respectful, and to respond only when spoken to, and she kept her breathing even and her posture relaxed. When the organizer finally spoke to her again, the request was made with care and clarity, asking if she could remain ready in case the delay continued. And the words were simple, yet they acknowledged her role in a way that felt new and unexpected. She agreed with a small nod and remained near the piano, and she did not allow herself to imagine what might follow, because imagination had never been part of her survival. And instead she focused on the present moment and the steady rhythm of her breath. The piano stood quietly, and she felt a familiar comfort in its presence, and she thought of the many hours she had spent playing in empty rooms for no one but herself, and how those moments had taught her to listen inwardly and trust what she felt rather than what others expected. Across the hall, some audience members exchanged subtle looks and faint smiles, and a few seemed to relax into their seats as if the music had opened a door they did not know they wanted opened, and this shared response deepened the sense of connection in the room. The organizers continued to manage the schedule, and the delay stretched slightly longer than planned, and the hall remained calm rather than restless. And this calm became its own message that the audience was ready to listen rather than simply observe. The young woman sensed that her presence had become part of the unfolding event, and this realization did not make her feel proud or afraid, but simply present. And she understood that whatever happened next would ask her to respond honestly rather than perfectly. As she waited, she felt gratitude for the simple tune that had carried her into this moment, and she felt respect for the space and the people within it, and she held these feelings quietly without display. The room settled into a shared stillness that felt intentional and alive, and the young woman remained ready without anticipation and without retreat, and this balance marked the final movement of part one as the story prepared to move forward into what would soon be asked of her, and how she would answer at the moment arrived without ceremony. And the shift was felt more than heard as one of the organizers stepped forward and addressed the audience with a calm voice, explaining that there would be a brief change in the order of the program, and the words were simple, yet they carried an undercurrent of intention that made the room lean in. The young woman listened from her place near the piano, and she felt the attention of the hall gather not sharply but steadily, and she understood that whatever came next would no longer be invisible, and this understanding settled in her body like a quiet truth she could not turn away from. The organizer then turned toward her and spoke her name clearly and respectfully, and asked if she would be willing to play once more, just a simple piece to continue holding the space, while preparations were completed, and the tone was careful, as if acknowledging that something unexpected had already happened. She stood slowly and felt every movement as she approached the piano, and she did not rush because rushing had never helped her, and instead she focused on grounding herself through familiarity and intention, and she placed her hands on the keys with the same respect she always had. The audience watched now openly, and not with judgment but with curiosity and readiness, and the young woman did not look up because she knew that her strength came from listening inwardly rather than outwardly, and she began to play the same simple tune once again. This time, however, the sound carried more ease and depth, not because she intended to impress, but because the space itself had changed and allowed her to breathe more freely, and the melody flowed with gentle confidence and natural warmth. The hall responded quietly, and people leaned into the sound without effort, and the usual distance between performer and listener softened, and the music moved through the room as if it belonged there rather than being placed there. As she played, she felt a steady calm rather than nerves, and she realized that the piano had always been a place where she could exist fully without explanation, and that this moment was no different despite the presence of others. The organizers stood still listening, and they no longer whispered or moved, and the delay no longer felt like an interruption, but like a necessary pause that had revealed something honest and grounding. The audience remained silent and attentive, and the absence of reaction felt more meaningful than applause because it signaled presence rather than evaluation, and the young woman sensed this without needing to see it. When the tune came to its close, she allowed the final sound to settle fully, and she lifted her hands slowly and remained still for a brief moment, not to create effect, but to honor the music and the quiet that followed. This silence did not feel empty, and instead it felt shared and complete, and in that silence the young woman understood that she had crossed from being unnoticed to being witnessed, and that this shift had happened naturally without force or intention. She stood and stepped back once more, and this time the room did not rush to return to motion, and the pause lingered gently as if everyone understood that something real had taken place. And this understanding carried part one to its edge, where the simple tune had already become more than it was meant to be. The pause that followed felt settled rather than uncertain, and the audience remained attentive even as the organizers quietly resumed their movements and prepared to continue the program. And the young woman stood beside the piano, aware that the space now held her differently than before. She returned to her seat near the edge of the stage and rested her hands in her lap, and she noticed that her breathing remained steady and calm, and this surprised her because she had expected a rush of emotion or fear, yet what she felt instead was clarity and presence. Around her, the hall began to shift back toward its planned rhythm, yet the tone had changed, and people sat with a softness that had not been there earlier, and conversations did not resume right away, and the usual impatience did not return. The organizers exchanged quiet looks and subtle nods, acknowledging without words that the moment had mattered, and one of them glanced toward the young woman with a look that carried respect rather than instruction, and this small change stayed with her. She felt an awareness grow within her that playing the piano was not only something she did alone anymore, and that realization did not feel like loss but like expansion. And she understood that music could exist both privately and publicly without losing its honesty. The audience eventually began to shift and adjust as the next part of the program prepared to begin, and yet many eyes returned briefly to the piano, and to the place where she sat as if holding onto a feeling they did not want to forget. She remained composed and quiet, and she did not seek acknowledgement, and she did not retreat either, and this balance felt new and grounding, and she sensed that it would shape how she moved forward from this moment. Behind the scenes, the original performer arrived and preparations resumed, and the event continued according to plan. And yet the energy of the hall had already been changed, and that change lingered gently beneath everything that followed. As the evening progressed, the young woman completed her remaining tasks with the same care she always had, and she did not speak about what had happened, and no one asked her to explain, and this silence felt respectful rather than dismissive. When the event drew closer to its end, and the audience began to leave, she moved through the hall collecting small items and straightening spaces, and several people passed her without recognition, while a few offered brief nods or quiet smiles, and these gestures were simple yet meaningful. She understood then that not every transformation needed to be announced, and that some moments were powerful precisely because they unfolded without display, and this understanding gave her a sense of calm confidence she had not known before. As the hall slowly emptied, and the lights dimmed, the piano remained at the center of the stage, silent once more, and the young woman paused for a moment to look at it, and she felt gratitude rather than attachment, and she turned away knowing that this was only the beginning of a longer story still waiting to be told. As the final guests left the hall and the doors closed behind them, the space returned to a quiet that felt deeper than the silence before the event, and the young woman moved slowly through the room, helping with the last tasks, and allowing the weight of the evening to settle naturally within her. She felt tired in a gentle way, and her body carried the memory of the music without tension, and she realized that the act of playing had not taken anything from her, and instead it had clarified something she had always known but never named. The organizers spoke softly among themselves, and their voices no longer carried urgency, and when one of them passed by her, they thanked her simply without ceremony, and this acknowledgement felt sincere and complete without the need for explanation. She gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, and before stepping away, she glanced once more toward the stage where the piano stood waiting in stillness, and she did not feel pulled toward it or away from it, and this balance felt right. As she walked out of the hall, the night air met her calmly, and the city sounds returned, reminding her that life continued in ordinary ways, and she welcomed this return to normal because it grounded her in reality rather than illusion. On her way home, she reflected quietly, not on the audience or the attention, but on the feeling of being fully present while playing, and she understood that this presence was something she could carry with her regardless of setting or recognition. She did not imagine future performances or changes, and she did not create stories around what might happen next. And instead, she focused on the truth that she had honored her relationship with music and remained honest to herself in a space that had not expected it. When she reached home, she rested and allowed the day to close naturally, and the simple tune she had played echoed softly in her memory, not as a performance, but as a conversation she had been ready to have when the moment arrived. This quiet ending did not resolve everything, and it did not promise transformation, yet it marked a clear beginning where something authentic had entered the open and could no longer be unseen. Part 1 concludes here with a foundation built on sincerity, presence, and restraint. And from this foundation, the story is ready to move forward into deeper recognition, challenge, and change driven not by ambition, but by truth shared through sound.